Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to ESG Talks, a KBRA podcast series focusing on environmental, social, and governance, ESG. This podcast series highlights various ESG hot topics and includes commentary from prominent voices within the ESG community. In this episode of ESG Talks, Karen Daly, a senior managing director on KBRA's public finance team, interviews Gavin Taves, the climate and energy program manager for the City of Chicago's mayor's office. In his role, Gavin focuses on built environment decarbonization policy for Mayor Lightfoot, program managing Retrofit Chicago, a voluntary building retrofit challenge, and the city's benchmarking ordinance. Gavin also spearheads the industrial decarbonization strategy, which aims to bring industrial facilities into alignment with broader climate goals for the region. Further, Gavin is one of the architects of the city's historic $188 million climate investment strategy, which will accelerate Chicago's just transition while building community resilience to climate shocks and stressors. Prior to joining the city, Gavin was the policy director for the Illinois Environmental Council. Karen and Gavin talk about Chicago's vulnerability to climate change and how the city is working to mitigate its effects.
Gavin, it's great to have you with us today. I know that our audience will be very interested to hear what you have to say about the city of Chicago and climate change. So let's get right to it. We know that Chicago is built on reclaimed swampland, making it more susceptible to the water level volatility of Lake Michigan and the Chicago River. Many in our audience have likely read the New York Times article published in July, A Battle Between a Great City and a Great Lake. That article detailed the unique climate challenges that Chicago faces. Gavin, can you help us understand the risks stemming from climate change that the city is exposed to, given the delicate interplay between Lake Michigan and the Chicago River?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Karen, for having me on the podcast. I'm really looking forward to talking about climate change, Chicago, and our future. This is a really critical problem and issue area that the city is taking an all-of-government approach to. So a little bit of context for folks who may not have read the New York Times article. What we know about the Chicago water ecosystem and the landscape of our Chicagoland region is that we lie in essentially a depressed, swampy area between Lake Michigan and the Mississippi Valley. This gave us really historic advantages to have expedited trade processes, which made Chicago one of the hubs of regional trade and infrastructure and transportation and freight today. It kind of cemented us, no pun intended, as one of the manufacturing and industrial centers of the Midwest and of the entire country. However, this location that we are currently, residing in, on the ancestral ground of the Potawatomi tribe and other folks as well, this land is susceptible to water-related risks in various ways. So let's take a quick look at exactly what's going on at the ground level here. Lake Michigan is, susceptible to climate change like any other water body is in the world. While Chicago is deemed as a rather climate safe city compared to, Miami or potentially New York post Sandy or Los Angeles in certain ways due to wildfires, we share our own, complex combination of climate risks, including from water. So what is going on currently is that there are climatic shifts happening because of man-made greenhouse gas emissions that are impacting global temperatures and seasonal shifts. For Lake Michigan specifically, what we see is this really delicate balance between evaporation of the water of Lake Michigan and precipitation that fills up the lake every year on a seasonal basis. Now, when that balance is shifted, when there is either too much precipitation, too much rain, or too much evaporation, too much of the water leaving the body, it causes instability in the lake system. And this affects how high and how low the Chicago River is as well. And so what we see is that during major rain events, sometimes the lake can already be, historically high and unseasonally high due to, increased rain. And what happens is that in these major storm events in the city of Chicago, if the lake is too high and the river, which flows away from the lake towards the Mississippi River, it gets too high as well. We know that the wastewater treatment plants in the city of Chicago cannot handle that amount of water. And so what happens is we use our really complex system of underground reservoirs, and we rely on lagoons and different forms of gray infrastructure in the city of Chicago to absorb that water, hold it for a period of time, and then treat it later when the storm event subsides. But in this era of climate change, we find that these rain events are often so extreme that those reservoirs cannot hold anymore, even though they're the size of two giant parks, essentially, two central parks, the size of New York Central Parks, and 30 feet deep. That's the size you can kind of imagine. They can't absorb all this water. So what ends up happening is that our combined sewage overflow systems, our outfalls, are forced to release all of their waste and all of that wastewater into the Chicago River. And this is a huge, huge issue. And when that water is pumped into the Chicago River, sometimes we need to open up the lock that separates the Chicago River from Lake Michigan and push that water back out into the lake in order to save us from flooding throughout the city. And that causes, major environmental contaminants for the lake and can result in just flooding downtown and throughout some of our most disenfranchised and disinvested neighborhoods. And this is a really, really big problem. And just a quick extra point here, if the lake level is too high and there's a rain event, you can't lift up the lock to release the water back into Lake Michigan, because the way that gravity works, if the lake level is too high and the river isn't quite that high, but it's still flooding, and if you try to open up the lock, the actual lake is going to flood into the Chicago River, which causes this huge issue going forward as we deal with major storm events. Now, this is a really, really big problem, and it's not something that is unknown to the city or to the nonprofit sector. And there are lots of really incredible folks who are really dedicating themselves to this, including, the Alliance for the Great Lakes, the Metropolitan Planning Council, the City of Chicago's Department of Water Management, the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District. There are tons of folks who are convening together to find solutions to this. And there really are a suite of options that we are pursuing currently in our capital planning, in our pursuit of some of the infrastructure bill dollars in order to do some of this preparation for the future. So, that's the quick landscape of what we're dealing with and what the challenges are that are facing Chicago. But I am looking forward to diving into how we're going to address this, because we're in a historic moment, kind of at a nexus for action, and the city is taking really important steps to do that work. So that's the landscape, and I'm happy to dive in to some of the specific details on solutions that we're pursuing at the city.
Thanks, Gavin. That is fascinating. And what also fascinated me when I read the article was the heroic feats of engineering that was described by a number of the city's employees. So let's turn to planning on the part of the city. How is Chicago thinking about and planning for the unpredictability of changing water levels over the longer term?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the question. So we are pursuing water and climate resiliency broadly, again, from this all of government approach. We know that there is no one department, no one federal agency who can do all of the planning for the city of Chicago, and no one person should be tasked with the responsibility of doing climate resiliency planning. So the city of Chicago, among other cities across the nation who are doing some real pioneering, incredible work in this sector, we're pursuing a bunch of options. So I'm going to walk through a few clear examples here to explain the suite of solutions that we're coming up with. Number one, a lot of this has to do with the amount of money that we can dedicate to the issue. And we're really excited to have increased the amount of money that we're dedicating to water resiliency broadly. And I'll give some examples of that. So talking about money and talking about where the physical resources come from to do this work, on the coastal resiliency side of all this, actually looking at the lakefront itself and building on the resiliency to maintain our beaches and kind of the buffer against some of the storm patterns that can cause a lot of erosion and flooding on the lakefront itself. We have a pre-existing relationship with the Army Corps of Engineers, and also many millions of dollars allocated in our capital plan every year in order to do this climate resiliency work on the coast. And this includes, building up buffers on beaches and making sure that we have erosion barriers to maintain the sand and the natural infrastructure that has for so many years protected most vulnerable buildings on the shore. Now we know, with climate change increasing the susceptibility of water-related damage, we know that we need more infrastructure in these locations that are particularly susceptible. So we are increasing the amount of capital dollars that we're investing in climate resiliency in our 5-year planning cycles. Now, that's just the capital planning side of what we do. For the rest of the city, moving away from the actual coast, the Lake Michigan shoreline, we are pursuing a whole host of plans in order to adapt to our changing climate and to the changing reality. Number one, we are leading all of this work through an equity lens. Essentially, we are looking at where the most disinvested, disenfranchised communities are being disproportionately harmed by climate change and doing strategic infrastructure, both gray and green infrastructure developments and construction in those communities. We know through just historic data, because of redlining and a variety of other policy decisions, that certain communities are specifically susceptible to the risks of climate change, specifically flooding. We see that flood insurance claims in Black and brown communities in Chicago is disproportionately higher when it comes to the rest of the city. And so this racial inequity is something that we're really worried about and something that we are committed to addressing. So in these specific communities, we're pursuing a suite of options. Our recent kind of fiscal and annual financial planning process allowed us to issue a bond for climate resiliency to the tune of about $200 million. Within this proposal, we're committed to doing a variety of green infrastructure and gray infrastructure projects that will specifically be able to take on the challenge of increased precipitation and storm events in the city. So one of the proposals that we're really excited about is partnering with the Chicago Public Schools and the Space to Grow program to retrofit schoolyards across the hundreds of Chicago public school properties in order to create essentially a catch basin underneath the schoolyards to provide micro resiliency for storm events throughout the city. Now, this approach to doing green and gray infrastructure, where we're doing rain gardens at the school, but then also these large basins underneath the new schoolyards, will allow us to have a patchwork of infrastructure throughout the city to complement the existing reservoir tunnels that we discussed in the first question, and some of the lagoons and other catchments that are already catching a lot of the rainwater from these major events. So this Space to Grow investments will be one of the critical pieces of this patchwork proposal. And specifically, we're looking to invest in these green and resilient and stormwater catching schoolyards across the city, but specifically in communities of color and in areas that are disproportionately harmed by climate change. So after doing some of that work, we're also looking to do a strategic expansion of some of our nation-leading work in the Green Alley program. We have been doing this for many years, but providing, pervious, essentially pavers and different kinds of infrastructure in street replacement and new street paving and in our alleys allows for water to actually trickle down into the ground as opposed to being sent into the actual water system, our pipe infrastructure and our combined sewage system, which can, cause these overflow events. So if we can catch that water before it goes into the sewer, it allows us to offset the potential challenges that comes from overflow events and flooding in an area. So by creating green alleys, providing this pervious infrastructure for water to actually seep down into the ground, we can offset some of the flooding that takes place. So we're investing in a meaningful investment there as well. And these are just a couple examples. We have specific projects in the Chatham neighborhood that we're looking to pursue, which floods at a very high rate. And it's just an example of how we're allocating, this extra money from our bond financing combined with our capital planning over the years in order to find real solutions for real people, and then strategically investing those dollars in the communities that are disproportionately harmed. So that's just a kind of a quick taste of what we're looking to accomplish and how we're pursuing it financially.
Thank you for that. That was really, really interesting, especially the example of what was the work that's being done with the schools. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us about how the city is adapting to and mitigating the risks that climate change poses to the city and its infrastructure?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have all day. I would love to go through the whole suite of options and our really exciting climate portfolio. I'm especially privileged to be part of an administration and a climate team at the mayor's office in Chicago that is really dedicated to doing this climate adaptation and mitigation work in the most equitable way possible. This is part of Mayor Lightfoot's agenda to do an equitable recovery from the COVID pandemic while providing real climate resiliency for all of her constituents. So yes, there are a bunch of programs I would love to talk about, but I'll give you a quick snippet just so I can plug our really exciting budget process and the bond that we are using as our down payments on some of our climate action planning work. So starting from the first part of the planning process here, right now, the city of Chicago is in this really exciting climate plan update from the 2008 plan, and we're doing this climate planning updating for 2021. And this new climate plan is going to host a variety of strategic interventions and initiatives that are, again, guided by equity to prepare Chicago to adapt to a changing climate, as well as mitigating our contribution to global climate change. As part of this plan, we are doing a down payment concept of $188 million, which really is a pioneering move and is not very common when it comes to local regional planning concepts actually have money to dedicate to the work right off the bat. So we have this $188 million that is from a bond issuance this year that is going to dedicate money to four big pockets of money. One being community and environmental justice investments, one being equitably growing the tree canopy, energy and equity, and green infrastructure. Within the community and environmental justice investments, we're proposing a river remediation project, doing the actual catchment and skimming of major contaminants that are in the river, so cleaning up the river from these overflow events. We're looking to do organic compost diversion to lower the actual waste that is going into our landfills, and doing this through really innovative community compost drop-off sites. We're also looking to decarbonize a lot of the city fleet and vehicles. So we're going to dedicate some $10 million to actually decarbonizing, electrifying our city fleet and our buildings. And a really exciting project here that has direct relation to the two biggest threats that we face in the climate change sphere in Chicago. We are looking to plant 75,000 extra trees on top of our existing tree planting portfolio over the next 5 years. Now, this is a really, really critical part of what we're trying to accomplish. Number one, we know that trees offer myriad benefits to the city when it comes to climate adaptation and mitigation. Number one, these trees absorb stormwater, again, reducing the burden on the great infrastructure that we rely on. So kind of providing that green infrastructure bounds to the solution for flooding. But they also have what we call evapotranspirative properties. So when a tree is planted and when it matures, it takes up water, and then through the photosynthetic process, it releases moisture into the air, which actually causes a cooling effect. So when we have these major heat days in the city of Chicago, we know that areas with greener and more mature tree canopies provide major cooling benefits for that area. And that can reduce the amount of respiratory issues and heat related illnesses in an area. So we're really invested in providing that option and that, that green element and green infrastructure solution for our residents. And really, this is also a carbon offsetting technique because each tree takes up CO2, which is part of our solution to mitigating our impacts on global climate change. For energy and equity, we're going to be dedicating $41 million to a suite of retrofitting existing buildings that are in our low and medium income profile as part of our Department of Housing supported program. And this work is going to be really critical to building climate resilience as well. We're building in the idea of at-home health and resiliency so that each unit that we invest in will have both lower utility bills, will also be more resilient when it comes to climate change, and will be more comfortable for the residents who are living there. We're also proposing the installation of 5 community solar operations on our public libraries, and then piloting a really exciting industrial community solar project, looking to do community solar on the rooftop of an industrial facility, trying to pioneer a new way for us to utilize this existing space and to allow for community solar subscriptions in our communities that need them most. So, and then I already went over the green infrastructure elements as part of the flood mitigation strategy, so I won't go into that detail. But this is just, again, a taste of that $188 million investment. It is our real down payments on climate action. And this work is going to happen in the next 5 years, and we're extremely excited to get started.
Thank you. That was terrific. I know our audience is interested in the budgeting process. Can you take a few minutes, Gavin, and talk to us about how Chicago is incorporating climate adaptation, resiliency, and climate mitigation in its budgeting process?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that question, Karen. So this is one of the crucial areas that we're spending a lot of time thinking about on the policy and finance teams in the mayor's office. So what we know is that doing this complex climate adaptation and mitigation work requires the stacking of different financing sources to make each dollar stretch as far as it can go. Now, we are in an unprecedented time right now. We have an infrastructure bill that has passed Congress. We are hoping that a Build Back Better bill will also be passed, and we will be able to utilize those federal funds. We have the Clean and Equitable Jobs Act at the state level in Illinois, which is providing unprecedented benefits for local climate planning and energy projects in the city. And then on top of that, we have an existing capital plan as part of our budgeting process in Chicago. And we have a bond plan and a bond issuance that is supporting our climate work. So you can see that we need to weave all of this together in order to provide the maximum benefits for the folks who need climate action most in the city. And this is something that we are strategically thinking about every single day. It's how do we look at the budgeting process and the capacity building development that needs to happen at the department level at the city of Chicago to make this work. So this is something that is really top of mind for folks, and we're excited to do even more work on this. But just to quickly go into a little bit more detail here, the finance office in the city of Chicago is really taking a specific look at integrating climate resiliency planning into all of its operations. So most recently, we have been undergoing an ESG rating process at the city level. We have also just received our A- scorecard from the CDP Climate Disclosure Program. So we have received an A- for our climate adaptation and mitigation strategies, which kind of helps build our financial profile when it comes to showing investors that we have a real commitment to doing climate action work and that is meaningful and substantive. So the idea here is that we are taking a look at every single financing opportunity, whether it comes from a utility, whether it comes from the state, the federal government, or our local government, monies, and looking to combine them all to stretch each dollar as far as they can go. And this systemic and strategic operation will allow us to deliver the most benefits possible to communities, specifically communities of color and those that are disproportionately affected by climate change, and really drive home the equity agenda that our city deserves. And so that's the approach that we're taking right now. Again, I've said this, I think this is probably my third time saying it, but it is an all of government approach. We need to integrate all of this work into each of our departments, which we are planning to do, through the climate action planning process, making sure that we have alignment with our goals and our initiatives across the city, and then taking that money from the bond, from our federal dollars and from the state, and strategically investing them with partnerships across the region in order to drive these benefits for our community. And that's really what it's all about. Strategically taking the money, having everybody on board, and then coming up with real meaningful implementation processes that can get these dollars delivered to the communities that need them.
Thank you, Gavin. That was terrific. Let's return to a topic that you touched on earlier, and the topic of inequality. We know that lower income communities and neighborhoods often face the worst consequences of extreme weather and other events related to climate change. What are some strategies or recovery programs to ensure that the challenges these communities face are being addressed in the city of Chicago?
Thanks, Karen. I really appreciate that question. This is a critical component of all of our climate action planning, and really everything that we're doing at the city. The mayor and our chief sustainability officer, Angela Tovar, as well as the entire team of folks that I work with, consistently use an equity lens to do all of our work. It is foremost in front of mind for all of our policy developments and the implementation of that policy. So I want to give a couple concrete examples to describe how equity is being used as the lens to do policy development, and then how it guides the actual investment of capital and other just governmental dollars into communities. So I'm going to give two key examples. The first being our equitable tree planting strategy. Right now, the city is undergoing a process to establish an equity criteria of where those 75,000 trees from the bond that I mentioned previously are going to be invested and planted. So we are developing essentially a scoring metric based on equity statistics to determine which communities need this tree investment most. And you can see here that using that as the lens and using that as the driver for whatever metrics are being relied on to plant trees provides these opportunities for unparalleled equitable investment in communities that need these trees most. So we know that redlining specifically, which was a predatory process throughout the 20th century that essentially gutted the value of homes in Black and Brown communities due to just predatory lending processes and disinvestment in specific communities because of race and origin. That has left a bunch of our communities without the physical tax base to have certain amenities. And through that gutting of the tax base, we know that we don't have climate resiliency because there, for example, are very few mature trees in areas that have been redlined. We know that there are big gaps in the urban tree canopy. We know that roads and streets and other infrastructure that could potentially, absorb stormwater or provide resilience to major heat events just aren't there because there isn't a tax base to support some of that planning and investment. So using that as a historic lens, we are taking an approach that provides equity as the lens to our investment processes. So I described trees as being one. Another really critical example here is looking at flooding. So I mentioned previously the disproportionate rate of flooding in communities of color near the Chicago River and near our other water bodies. Now, we know that communities of color specifically and low income folks, they make up the lion's share of flood insurance claims in the city. And you can see if you look at maps, the Metropolitan Planning Council has done really incredible work on this. When you assess their maps, it's really just stark. It's the south and southwest side and west side, which have a lot of folks of color in our city. They're just being hit by these monstrous flooding events in their basements, and they have to file these major claims. So we're using this data to find opportunities for strategic in-home investments in climate resiliency, building on that retrofitting concept that I talked about previously, in order to shore up any potential leaks and to provide flood drain tiles in homes and do downspout disconnection on the outside of homes to prevent flooding. And the list goes on for what a retrofit can accomplish. But the idea here is to use these equity statistics and these equity metrics as the guiding principle for where we put our dollars and where we are making the most meaningful investment. So those are just two quick examples, but the idea here is that equity comes first in everything that we do for policy development, but then specifically for implementation at the departmental level, those equity lenses, those equity selection criteria allow for dollars to be strategically invested in areas that need them most. And that is the way that we pursue equity as the driving force at the city.
Gavin, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. This has been really, really incredible. Karen, do you mind if I plug a few resources while I'm here?
No, go right ahead.
Wonderful. So the city of Chicago has a new climate action plan that will be released in the spring of 2021. If you go to cityofchicago.org/climate action plan, you can find details on the planning process and a great summary of basically the work that we're doing. And again, this equitable process by which we're developing it. It has required a bunch of community engagement, a bunch of internal stakeholder engagement to create the most substantive, equitable, and meaningful climate action plan with this $180 million down payment on the real initiatives to make this meaningful and very real for the people of Chicago. So I'm really thankful, Karen and the rest of the folks here at KBRA for giving me the opportunity to talk about, what is really just the passion of my life. This is the work that I am deeply committed to. And this is the most meaningful work that we can do for the city. And it is truly a privilege to be doing it every day. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about it, to plug some of our work, and to talk about how much I love Chicago too, because it's I think it's the best city in the country. No offense to anyone else out there.
Well, thank you, Gavin. It was great talking to you today, and hope we speak soon.
I would love that. Thanks so much, Karen.
Thank you to Gavin and Karen for a very interesting discussion. Please email esg@kbra.com with any questions or comments. We also encourage you to visit KBRA's ESG website at esg.kbra.com, where you can find ESG research related to the topics discussed in this episode, further details on KBRA's ESG approach, and other ESG-related media items. You can also join our mailing list to access our ESG Weekly Roundup newsletter. This concludes our episode. New episodes of ESG Talks air every other week. In the meantime, please visit kbra.com to access our other podcast series, as well as our ratings and research.